Okay, so first of all, thank you. When I started my OY, I had high hopes, but I wasn't quite sure how much interest there would be early on. We're starting a baseball channel in the middle of January. Not exactly the hottest time for a team that's really not done a whole heck of a lot in the offseason, in my personal opinion. I mean, they've made some moves, but wasn't sure how hot the content would be. But already 168 subscribers, which isn't doesn't compete with some of these other YouTube channels, but it's much more than I thought we would have early on. I really appreciate the support. Please, if you think people will like this stuff, share it. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. I know it's annoying to hear that stuff over and over and over again, but it is how this channel will survive. And I'm really excited to be doing this stuff again. We're going to talk about the Mariners rotation today. I was thinking about starting with the bullpen and then building to this stuff, but I don't want to start with the bullpen. The bullpen is not fun to talk about. It's a really good bullpen, but bullpens aren't that fun. But I can't wait to do my YouTube video on the bullpen as well. Okay. This is so again, I've been a Mariner fan my entire life. I've rooted for this team since I was able to formulate what actually rooting for a baseball team was. On paper, this is the best Seattle Mariner rotation of all time. Might be a pretty hot take because there was this certain guy who was pretty tall who threw pretty hard. That was pretty good. And, there were some decent names behind that guy as well. But I don't think we've ever had the quality and quantity that the Seattle Mariner rotation has had. It's really good. Having said that, I do think there's some areas for some concern. And concern may be too strong of a word, but I will go over. We're going to look at the rotation options. It seems pretty set in stone right now, but I'm going to go over about 8 guys who could be in this rotation at some point of the year. And one of the big concerns that I have with this rotation, just to start things off on a negative note, because that's what I do. It is very hard to have the health luck, and luck is probably a strong word, but it is very hard to have the same kind of success again in terms of having everybody stay in the rotation as often as they did 2 years in a row. That is my biggest concern. But my biggest optimism from that is they do have some arms behind the projected five that have a chance for success. So let's start at the top. Luis Castillo, who is pretty clearly to me going to be the opening day starter. I was so impressed with what we saw from Castillo after that trade. And let's talk about that trade for just a second. I talked about this on Mollywop Monday. By the way, Mollywop Monday coming back. Really excited for that as well. Mondays, I will assume it'll be 1 p.m. again. Shout outs to my buddies Ian, Kevin, Jessamine, our new producer, Anders, Kevin Shockey, everybody who's been involved in that show. Love it. Definitely check it out. It's going to be a hoot and a holler. But so they did give up a lot. There's no question about it. Noelvi Marte has a chance to be a really good player. A lot of people I talk to, and I need to see it more in person before I can make this judgment or even just watch more video. Think Edwin Arroyo could actually be better than Noelvi Marte, partially because he's so much more likely to play shortstop than Marte is. In fact, you could just throw shortstop out the door pretty much with Marte right now. But he's got a chance to be a really good one, and they've added some other couple of pieces that have a chance to help. Having said that, you make that trade every time because the Mariners needed this type of arm at the top of their rotation. And I think Luis Castillo, for the most part, is a legitimate ace. I think he's a legitimate. You talk about there's top of the rotation arms, there's aces, and then there's like another level above ace. No, he is not the healthy Jacob DeGrom. He is not the healthy Max Scherzer of a couple of years ago. He is not of that ilk. But he's that notch below to me. I think he is a top dozen starter in baseball. He's been pretty good with health. He did have some health stuff at the beginning of the year, but he really pitched through it and was so good with Seattle. And those 2 postseason starts he made, outside of Jordan Alvarez, who we're going to talk about as little on this channel as possible, just because he's caused some heartbreak, I think. But we'll have to talk about him when we're doing our daily recaps, obviously. Outside of that unbelievable effort by Alvarez to take that pitch out to left field in that absolute joke of a left field of a ballpark, he was spectacular. His start against the Blue Jays was maybe the best postseason start the Seattle Mariners team has had. And I know that's darning with faint praise a little bit, but he dominated a really good Blue Jays lineup, a really, really good Blue Jays lineup who just beat the crap out of the guy we're going to talk about next in the next game. And, maybe part of that was because it's very hard to hold a lineup like that down 2 games in a row. But I think Luis Castillo is a legitimate start, set it and forget it ace pitcher. I'm just looking at his baseball savant page here, and none of the metrics are like, whoa. You know what I mean? By the way, you will see me doing some typing in these videos. A lot of people would be professional and have all of their notes on the side and be ready for something like that. We talked about it in the first video. That's not going to happen, baby. I am going to not have editing in this stuff, and I am not going to have the razzle dazzle of having an actual show sheet. But, he's in the 76th percentile in strikeout percentage. He is in the 67th percentile in whiff percentage. He's in the 71st. I think this one is a little weird that they combine the two, but he's in the 71st percentile of expected ERA and expected weighted on base average. I mean, those are all really good numbers, but they're not like, whoa, where's the 90 percentile? Where's the Juan Soto or Aaron Judge 100th, 100th, 100th? No, he's not that guy. But when you combine all of those things and the fact that the only thing he was below average in is average exit velocity, which I think is a little misleading because his hard hit percentage, it was in the 53rd percentile. So I don't think you could be too concerned about that average exit velocity. When you add them all up together, you get a really good pitcher, a really, really good one. He is probably the player I have the least concern about on the roster. And you might be thinking, well, aren't you forgetting about a certain someone? And I'm not. I'm not. Believe me, I am not. But because of the fact that that certain player, who we will talk about an awful lot this year, is going into his second season and will have to make some adjustments, I know what Luis Castillo is. And what Luis Castillo is he's a top of the rotation starter. As long as he's healthy, I think that the Mariners are going to get spectacular production out of him. And again, you make that trade every time, and you make that extension with him every time too, because he's going to be a huge part of your roster for the next, I believe, 6 years is how long that extension is. So the second option, not as exciting to talk about, and kind of I don't know what the right word here is, but not the most popular Mariner by any stretch of the imagination, but Robbie Wright, who, by the way, Robbie Wright is only a year older than Luis Castillo. Does that surprise anyone? It should. I don't know why it should, but it should. I would call Robbie Wright's first season with Seattle up and down. And I do think that people were a little too harsh on him. One of the things with Robbie Ray was last year, especially. So for the old heads, I think kids maybe say old heads, or maybe old people say old heads. I know I'm old and I'm saying old heads. There was this thing with Jeff Fassero. You guys remember Jeff Fassero, one of the starters behind that big tall guy who threw really hard. Had one of the worst. He had two very good seasons with Seattle, good to very good seasons with Seattle, and then fell apart. Absolutely fell apart. Something like a 7.5 ERA, right around there. And he was expected to be that number two. And after every start, he would go, "Well, I just made one bad pitch," and everybody got real frustrated because that was clearly not true. It was not. It was a case of the fact that he just lost his ability to miss bats, on top of the fact that he was never exactly a strike throwing machine. With Robbie Ray, it wasn't just one bad pitch, but so many of these starts were just one bad inning. One bad inning just really threw everything apart. And look, it's a 9 inning game, and for starters, it's usually a 6 or 7 inning game. And taking away 15% of your start with one bad inning, is bad. It's really bad. It is going to affect your club in a big time way. But I think there was way more good with Robbie Ray than there was bad. A lot of people seem to disagree with this, and I think part of it is because of a large contract that was given to him, a totally fair contract, by the way. We'll get into how we're going to treat contracts on this show at some point, but just know I'm a little bit of a hippy dippy, and I don't feel too bad for billionaires spending money on baseball players. But because of that contract, and because he was coming off being the literal Cy Young Award winner, I think expectations were that he was going to be that top dozen starter. And I think that was just expecting a little too much. I think he is more along that lines of a very good number two starter. And if you look at the metrics here, that's kind of what he was. His whiff percentage was in the 80th percentile. His strikeout percentage was in the 78th percentile. His expected batting average was in the 67th percentile. His fastball velocity went down pretty darn good. That is my big concern with Robbie Ray. And the walk rate, while nowhere near, so for those unfamiliar, Robbie Ray has always missed bats throughout his career, but he has had significant issues with walks in the past. In 2021, he did not. He made a change in his delivery that simplified things and really allowed him to be not only better with his control, but his command, being able to hit his spots. It was better in 2022 than the other seasons, but it was nowhere close to as good in 2021. And down velocity and more walks is a bad combination, but he still has that filthy slider. He's still by no means a soft tosser. You're talking about a guy who can get it up to 95, 96, but averages more 93, which in the today's age is a mediocre fastball. But I still think he's going to miss a lot of bats. I think though he can keep the walks to a low roller, and he's going to get hitters to miss with that slider. He's going to get hitters to chase. So, do I think Robbie Ray is actually the number two on this team? To be honest with you, no, I don't. But at the same time, if you have a guy who can post a ERA is a flawed stat, but a 3.6 ERA and strike out 10 to 9.5 to 10 batters an inning and give you 160 to 170 innings, it's an awesome option. And I would guess that Robbie Ray is much better this year than he is last year, if I was just guessing. But there is some cause for concern just because of the fact that the velocity is going down, the walk rate wasn't nearly as good, and don't have him face Yordan Alvarez in a playoff game. Just maybe just don't do that, and things will go a little bit better. So you can kind of flip flop who we are talking about next, but I'm gonna just go with Logan Gilbert because I think he's more likely to be that third option than he is to be the fourth. We'll talk about that guy obviously as well. Logan Gilbert had a really strong first full season, really strong. I was really impressed with what he did in his playoff start against Houston as well. It wasn't dominant by any stretch of the imagination, but it was a strong way to end a really strong year. There are some legitimate concerns with Logan Gilbert, though, as well. And the biggest one is this guy gave up a lot of hard contact. He was in the bottom fifth percentile in hard hit percentage. So 45%, 0.6% of the time, this guy gave up hard contact. Here's the thing with the hard contact. This is more eye test than it is like backing it up with stats. And I'm going to do that. I do have scouting background. Sounds like a weird thing to say, but you guys know that I've written about prospects for a long time. A lot of that hard contact was to where he wanted them to make contact. I think Logan Gilbert pitches to contact quite a bit. And yes, there were some line drives that got straight up caught by whoever was playing second base, third base, shortstop. A few too many to left field. Those are obviously, and right field. Those are obviously cases where you get a little bit of luck. But I do think that he is a guy who really understands defensive positioning. It's worth pointing out that we'll have a limited shift next year. So we'll see how that affects things. But this guy pounds the strike zone. Not quite as much as the guy we're going to talk about next, but in the 72nd percentile in walk rate. He is so difficult to pick the baseball. I've talked to scouts about this as well, and Baseball Savant basically backs this up now. He's at the 99th percentile extension. It is a really 6'6", long arms, really difficult to pick up the baseball. But you look at these other rates, like 37th percentile in whiff, not abhorrent, but not great. 49th percentile in strikeouts, basically about average. 29th in expected batting average. 23rd in fastball spin. He's probably going to have to be more reliant on his secondary offerings. But let's keep in mind that this was a 25-year-old in his first full professional season who posted a 3.2 ERA in 185 and two-thirds innings. I was so impressed with how deep he was able to go last year. I thought they were going to have to shut him down at some point, and the fact that he was able to be that option, and yes, there were some ups and downs. He was a much better option in the first half, a legitimate all-star snub, who ended up being a solid option who went through some stuff in the second half, which young starters are going to do. Yes, you look at those metrics and say, boy, he is due for some regression. I think he's more due for ascension, to be completely honest with you. I think that you take a look at those numbers, and we do this with guys. We do. We think, oh man, we expected him to be much better at missing bats, or we expected him to be much better at avoiding hard contact. Where what we should be saying is, holy crap, a 25-year-old in his second season was able to post a 3.2 ERA. Yeah, that's results based stuff, but I do think that you have to be more impressed with what Gilbert did than come away disappointed. I think he is a very good mid rotation starter who has the upside to be a lot more. This next guy, I honestly think, though, has the upside to be a lot more, and I'm a little more confident in hitting it. But I do think he'll actually start the year as that fourth starter. George Kirby. Uh, I don't think people talk nearly enough about how impressive this guy's rookie season was. I mean, yes, he should have been a part of the rotation probably from the start of the season, and he was limited to 130 innings because he did have the break that he was given, and he needed it. I really do believe that he was in need of that. But you take a look at this, his walk percentage was in the 96th percentile. And to me, that's so misleading because it's based on basically three starts towards the end of the year where he just couldn't find the strike zone. But you look at this guy, his strikeout percentage was in the 63rd percentile. His expected ERA was in the 71st percentile. His expected batting average was in the 55th percentile. He gets the a similar extension, but not really. Like I think Logan Gilbert, we said, was in the 99th percentile in extension. Kirby's in the 74th percentile. His command is as good as any young pitcher I've seen for the Seattle Mariners. And there's been some pretty good ones. I mean, there's no Greg Maddux or anything like that, but there have been some Seattle Mariner pitchers who can throw strikes early on. George Kirby does it as well as anybody. And it's not just the fact that he throws strikes. There is a difference between command and control. Just go look up the difference on the internet. This is already a 18-minute video. I don't want to have you guys here all day talking about this stuff, but his ability to actually locate his offerings is as good as anybody's in the Seattle Mariner rotation. Period. I guess my concern here is how much better can he be? I think he can be better. I definitely think he can. I think that his secondary offerings can be better. I think he can start getting hitters to chase more. I want to see it though. I want to see George Kirby get hitters to swing at those pitches outside of the strike zone. Chase rate in the 45th percentile, whiff rate in the 15th percentile. I don't think he's ever going to be an elite bat misser, but I think he's going to initiate an awful lot of weak contact. I will say this. This will be my hot take of the video. I think George Kirby will be the number 2 starter for the Seattle Mariners by the end of the year. Like if hopefully we're talking about the Seattle Mariners playing in a ALDS, hopefully as a division winner. Hopefully somehow it's against the Kansas City Royals or something like that. You've got Luis Castillo starting game 1 and George Kirby starting game 2. And that's not an insult to Robbie Ray or Logan Gilbert. It's just I think Kirby's ability to command his stuff, miss just enough bats, and the poise he showed. He was so good in that game 3, which honestly I think ended about 15 minutes ago. He was so good in that option, in that start, that I'm just such a big fan. And again, that four competes with anybody in terms of talent. It really does. It doesn't have the same kind of. We're not talking about Smoltz, Clavin, Maddox. We're not. But we are talking about a rotation where every start you can feel confident about getting 6 innings and two or fewer runs. It, there are not a lot of rotations like that right now in baseball, and I think the Seattle Mariners have that. They also have a fifth starter, and I assume it's going to be Marco Gonzalez, and a lot of the reason why I assume it is because they just seem to be a little more confident with him than the other guy. And we're going to go more quick through these guys just because I spent way too long talking about the other three, to be completely honest with you. So Marco Gonzalez did not have a great year last year, in my personal opinion, and the numbers kind of bear that out. I don't think it was quite as bad as everybody thinks, but there were some legitimate reasons for concern here. And the one thing I'll say is that's the nice thing about this being your fifth starter. Like, and he may not be the actual fifth starter. They may have him start earlier. I know that they're kind of like having the lefty righty thing. I think that's nonsense, to be completely honest with you. But you know, teams still do it. They may want to split him up. I mean, there was very few pitchers in baseball who were worse at getting hitters to swing and miss. His K percentile was literally at the bottom of the league. His whiff percentage was in the fifth percentile. His fastball velocity was in the third percentile. His fastball spin was in the seventh percentile. His curveball spin was in the seventh percentile. Bad. But what he does is he throws strikes and he commands his stuff well. He put, like Kirby, he puts the ball where he wants to go. And that's one of the reasons why he doesn't give up a lot of hard contact. But he gives up a lot of contact. And you have to have a very good defense behind Marco Gonzalez. You just do. It is never going to be a guy, at points in his career, he's shown the ability to be a little bit better at missing bats, but he's going to get worse as that fastball velocity goes down. He's going to get worse. What's interesting here too is his chase rate was the best of any Seattle Mariners starter, 83rd percentile in getting hitters to swing at pitches outside of the strike zone. But they don't. You don't miss when you can pick up the ball off of him. There's no reason to think that he's going to miss a lot of bats. I think he's a fine fifth starter. I think at some point, if he's posting, like this guy had a 4.13 ERA. Like this, let's not act like. And again, I'm talking results here. If you look at the numbers, there's some luck with that 4.13 ERA. But we're not talking about somebody who was like awful. We were talking about the Jeff Fassero numbers that we were talking about earlier in the video. He just has to be much better if he's not going to be a guy who's skipped. And there's some question marks as to whether or not we could see uh, Gonzalez or Flexen, who we'll get to in just a second, traded. I know that there was interest in Flexen, especially at the deadline. There was some interest in Gonzalez as well. I think you got to hold on to both, and I'll talk about why you got to hold on to both as we get into Chris Flexen, who, just real quick, I think Chris Flexen deserves a lot of credit for being, from everything I've heard, totally honky dory with leaving the rotation after the Castillo trade, because Flexen wasn't pitching horribly by any stretch of the imagination. Obviously, you're not going to keep him in the rotation over Luis flipping Castillo, but he wasn't exactly like, what the heck are we going to do? I mean, he was a perfectly fine fifth starter. And I did know that that's exactly what we were going to get, even though he was much better than that statistically in 2021. It was pretty obvious that this is the version of Chris Flexen that we're going to get, which is still perfectly usable. I think he's more valuable as that swingman. I like having that guy. We talked about how confident I am in the rotation. There are going to be starts where it doesn't work out like that. There just are. There are going to be starts where you have to have somebody like Chris Flex to give you 2 1/3 innings. And you also can, use that guy for extra innings and, emergency situations. But I think that's what Chris Flexen is at this point. He is that swing man. He is that guy to give you 2 or 3 innings in non-high leverage situations. I mean, just real quick through the metrics, there's nothing he's above average at except for curveball spin. Nothing. He's not. Oh, he was not above average in walk. He was not this amazing strike thrower that I think you just kind of stereotype him to be. He was in the 40th percentile in walk percentage, and he doesn't get hitters to swing at those pitches that are outside of the strike zone. His strikeout percentage was in the ninth percentile. He's a swingman. Do I think you maybe have him and Gonzalez battle for a starting rotation spot? Yeah, I do. But ultimately, because of a lot of things, some of them to do with on the field, some of them to do with paychecks, and it's not like Chris Flexen's not getting paid a decent amount of money. I think it's $8 million. Ultimately, I think he's going to be the one who ends up in the bullpen. But it is nice to have somebody who is cromulent, to you steal a Simpsons word, as that option if there is an injury. There are some other guys here, though, I think, and we'll go through these again quick just because we are running short on time. Matt Brash is apparently going to be compete for a starting rotation spot. I don't see it. And it's nothing to do with Brash. It has more to do with the four names above and then the two that I think are ahead of him on the depth chart. And the fact that I think he's really valuable in that bullpen spot. And we'll talk about the bullpen again next week. But I was so impressed with what I saw from Brash as a reliever. And to be completely honest with you, outside of that first start he had, not terribly impressed with what I saw from him as a starter. And my concern with Brash as a starter is going to be, his command is bad. He's really, especially as a starter, he really can struggle. There's so much movement on his pitches, so much movement that unless his command takes like a couple grade jump, he's going to be more of a problem than a significant asset in terms of throwing strikes. Now, in relief, you can deal with that a little bit more. You can, as long as he's not just, you know, Mitch Williamsing out there, as long as he can just keep the ball inside of the strike zone and he can go max effort, I think it's a lot easier to justify. As a reliever, it's much more easy to justify, I should say. As a starter, it's really hard when you're doing so much self-inflicted damage. I get developing as a starter. I think it's fine to give it a look, knowing what you have as a bullpen arm. I don't really think that this is going to be a guy who's making a ton of starts over his big league career, and certainly not in 2023. So there are some minor league arms to kind of keep an eye on here as well. The most famous of these, of course, is Emerson Hancock, a guy who the Mariners took was, I believe, the sixth pick of the 2019 draft, 2020 draft. All of this stuff is just kind of running together for me. 2020. Hancock has not been dominant by any stretch of the imagination. Now, with 2020, obviously, there was a whole of a heck of a lot going on. 2022 finished with a 3.75 ERA, 92 strikeouts, 38 walks, and 98 in the third innings. Stats could be misleading. And when you see this guy at his best, you're talking about a guy with 3+ pitches, a fine curveball as well that he can use at times, usually around the strike zone. I think he has the upside when he's at his best to be a mid rotation starter. Probably not that number two or number one that I thought he was coming out of Georgia, but a solid starting option. Just hasn't shown that enough yet. And I would not be shocked if Emerson Hancock is a guy that they look at maybe making the move to the bullpen. I don't know if you guys remember his Futures game appearance where he was going max effort and just looked dominant. Something I think you've got to take a look at. Or I think Emerson Hancock makes a lot of sense in his trade stuff. And I do think there are some holes that this organization has to address in terms of that stuff. And Emerson Hancock is probably the most realistic trade option that they have. There are a lot of people who think that Bryce Miller is not just the best pitching prospect in the Seattle Mariners system. There are a lot of people who think Bryce Miller might be the best prospect overall in the system. I'm not one of those people. I think that that's Harry Ford, and I have Cole Young ahead of him as well. We'll probably talk about a lot of prospect stuff as we go through this channel. This guy's stuff is impressive. I mean, it is a legit plus fastball, maybe 65, but we'll go plus. This guy struck out 163 batters in 133 and 2/3 innings, and he allowed 195. He allowed a .195 average against. That's sick stuff. This is a guy too who has a really good slider. Has thrown a change and a curveball as well. That's pretty good stuff. Oh boy, see, this is where the edit button would have been great, but we'll just move on past whatever that was. 6'2", 180, not exactly, statuesque, but certainly I think it's good enough size to not be too worried about handling the modern rigors of a rotation. Is he going to throw enough strikes in 2023 to be a legitimate starting pitching option? That's my question mark. If he does, wouldn't shock me at all. And another guy that, like, if you're looking at the upside trade, a guy you're certainly looking at. And then the third option, who I don't think it's talked about enough, is Taylor Dollard. And I'll tell you this: I think some people are going to look at Taylor Dollard and compare him to Andrew Moore. And all due respect to Andrew Moore, I hope you're having a great life and continue to strive at whatever you're doing. That was never a legitimate option, in my opinion. He was George Kirby without the stuff to be George Kirby. And again, I love George Kirby, obviously. I just said he could be the second starter. But there is a minimum in stuff you have to be a successful starter that Andrew Moore just never had. I'm sorry, he just never had that stuff. That is not true about Taylor Dollard. No, there's no swing and miss out pitch here. But everything projects at least average, and his command is really good. He pounds the strike zone, and he was so impressive in his minor league year last year. 2.25 ERA, 131 to 31 strikeout to walk ratio, and 144 innings. Again, not dominant, but keeps the ball in the park. Allowed just a 203 average against. He's difficult to square up. Do I think he's a future ace or anything close? Absolutely not. In fact, I'm not even sure if he's a mid rotation arm, but I think he has a chance to be a back end arm. There's some other guys too you could see, and I still wonder if they'll sign somebody who's going to be that. Not Johnny Cueto. I don't know why that's the first arm that came to my mind, but somebody along the lines of that from the previous year, not the 2022 version of Cueto. That was really good. Somebody who is, just kind of waiting in the wings and probably will sign and have an opt out date of May 1st if he doesn't get a chance to pitch in the rotation. Someone along those lines, just to add some depth. But I do think the depth is okay here. And again, on paper, I think this is the best Seattle Mariner rotation I've seen. And it was awfully good last year. So it's not just on paper stuff. Like, yes, it's on paper. Everything is hypothetical until the season starts. But it was really good last year, too. It was really good. And I think a lot of those guys, particularly Gilbert and Kirby, have a chance to take that step up. And I think Castillo does, too. I really do. And I expect Ray to be better. And whatever you get out of Gonzalez and Flexen is just an added benefit. But you guys tell me what you think. How excited are you about this rotation? And again, please hit like, please hit subscribe. I know a 33-minute video is a little long, but you've got time. And you can just kind of skip through this as you go and, you know, all that stuff. But yeah, tell me what you think. Again, we've got a lot of stuff coming up, but if there is one thing to be excited about with the Seattle Mariners, and there's a lot actually, as much as people like to say I'm a negative guy, that's that rotation, man. It's good.